Buju wago shindigu minawa migazi indodem gazagaskwa jimekag hindunjiba. Today I'd like to share a little bit with you about the doctrine of discovery and how modern oppression dynamics really emerged. I think this is a topic that is maybe often talked about but not deeply understood. Starting about 10,000 years ago, all humans, all races, all groups tended to structure our societies in village-based communal terms. So that means we had relatively smaller family units. We hunted, we gathered, we foraged, we fished. And usually when we harvested food, we'd put all of our food together in some sort of common food cache. And then each person would take out of the food cache whatever they needed to feed their families. It worked really well. And at that point in time, pretty much all humans, all races, all groups had kind of earth-based worldviews and religious beliefs. Even though there was a lot of variation between the details of those, some of the essential components were really quite similar. In analyzing these things later on, this is what Karl Marx, who's sometimes known as the grandfather of modern communism, would call quote unquote primitive communism. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. About 10,000 years ago, we had a big change on planet Earth. There was a big shift in the climate. The last major ice age came to an end. And as the climate of planet Earth changed, and many more areas became much more temperate and well suited for the practice, human beings discovered agriculture. And we started to plant, till, and farm, and the productivity of human beings in producing food increased exponentially. And there wasn't one place where farming started. It started in numerous places all at the same time. So in Polynesia, in Japan, in other parts of Asia, in North America, South America, and especially in the Fertile Crescent, this area of the Eastern Mediterranean. Today we think of this area as a desert where Iraq, Iran, Israel, places like that are located. But at this point in time, it was really one of the most fertile areas of farmland in the world. And as human beings got more efficient at producing food, a number of things happened. So one is we had more babies. And when we had more babies, more of them survived and lived longer. Infant mortality rates decreased because of a more sustainable and consistent and stable food supply. So the human populations of the planet grew. And as it grew, then we started to develop not just villages, but bigger cities and more dense concentrations of human population, which meant that a whole bunch of other things could happen too. For starters, we had more time to do other things. So there was a flourishing in the arts and in music. We also had more people living more densely with more time to devote to other pursuits. And so there was an increase in the scale and the deadliness of conflict. All of this was kind of a perfect storm, and the human belief systems and ways of structuring societies really shifted and changed during this time period as well. So eventually, in the Fertile Crescent, the area that we now know of as the Middle East, someone figured out how to lock up the food. And whoever could control the key to access the resources that everyone had produced had a lot of power. So for example, a local lord, or sultan, or whatever the political figure happened to be in a certain area, could say, I'm not going to harvest it all today. but I need each of you to harvest for an extra half hour today. And if they controlled the key to access the food that everyone had produced, they could do that. And so what happened is, over a period of many years, our societies, instead of being quite egalitarian, started to become more striated, where we had some people who had more wealth than others, more access to resources than others, not because they worked harder, but because we were structuring societies differently. And if you think about it, the key, when we were locking up the food, the key eventually got monetized. It wasn't a key at all, it was money. So whoever held access to the money would be able to control access to the resources. And before that, you couldn't leverage other human beings to do things that they didn't want to do. You wouldn't have had, for example, prostitution, because there was no way that you could offer something that they couldn't otherwise get. When we were living in societies where everybody just took the food that they needed, there was no reason why someone would have sex with someone they didn't want to have sex with, because they could get everything they needed. But once you locked up the food, monetized the key, then you could leverage that. And so you saw these other kinds of shifts and changes in our society. There were other things that happened too. So here's a good book by Daniel Quinn called Ishmael. And in that book, he does a great analysis of Western religious traditions and what they have to say about this with an environmental lens. And he says that one of the things that happened when human beings locked up the food is it put us in conflict with other predator species. So for example, in places like the Middle East, human beings started to kill off the competitive predators. They killed off the lions, they killed off the bears, they killed off the wolves, and these kind of predators were demonized as evil beings. And eventually what happened is we converted more and more land to human food production. And the results were really pretty incredible. On this image here, the dark gray dots in the center represent the human population of planet Earth. The light gray dots around it represent our pets and livestock, and the green dots represent wild animals. Within the animal population, human beings and our pets and livestock dwarf all other forms of animal life. It's really quite astounding. And so, even in countries, connected to the Fertile Crescent, like in Europe, they got lions on the crests for, their nations and so forth, even though they eventually killed off all their lions, because there were, at one point, lions indigenous to places like Italy and so forth, but killed them all off. This created a kind of cascading effect in the striations of human society. So I think the environmental threat is one piece, but also the human to human contact and oppression dynamics is quite another. So eventually the societies got so striated, so hierarchical, that there was a belief in Europe and in the Middle East that some people were preordained by God to rule, and others were preordained by God to serve. That by the accidents of your birth, you were meant to be the ruler or the servant, and people tended to accept this belief, including the servants. It got you the feudal era, and the concept was known as the divine right of kings. That continued for quite a while, and various divinely empowered kings would fight with one another for control, dominion, essentially the monetized key and the resources that would be used to manipulate and control their fellow humans. Over time, there were other shifts. So you have the birth of major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the Roman Empire, which endured in various forms for a little over 500 years, had a huge imprint on the cultures around the Mediterranean, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And in Christianity, the language and the behaviors started to shift. They shifted from the divine right of kings to the divine right of Christian kings. That now the language was saying, and the edicts of the Pope were saying, that Christian kings were preordained by God to rule and all others to serve. And the Roman Empire, under the leadership of Constantine, started to forcibly convert the pagan kings of Europe into the Christian kings of Europe. So Christianity was spread at the point of a sword. And then once Europe becomes Christian, then they take the sword further east and begin dueling with the Muslims for control of Jerusalem and huge swaths of territory in the Middle East. As that happened, then you have a number of other developments. So at this point in time, the Pope is not just the religious figurehead that we think of the Pope as today. The Pope was actually the arbiter of political decisions and economic decisions for Christian nations. And the Pope wanted to get the Christian kings of Europe to quit killing each other and get busy going on crusades and killing Muslims. And in order to do this, the Pope came up with a series of edicts, sometimes called the papal bulls, named after the bulla or wax seal that was often put on papal documents. And within those, the Pope essentially said that Christian kings are preordained by God to rule and all others to serve. And that while there might be human beings in other parts of planet Earth, if a Christian king came to a land that was populated by non-Christian people, that the non-Christian people did not have the right to rule their own land and could not own their own land. They only had an aboriginal occupancy of their land. But if a Christian king came, or his vassal, they could plant a flag and say, I claim ownership of this land and all these people in the name of the most Christian king, insert name. And over time, what happened is these papal decrees were designed to say, France, you can colonize here, Spain there, Portugal there, England over here, France there, and so forth, so they wouldn't be fighting each other. That part did not succeed. Look at France and England. They fought each other terribly for hundreds of years. But that was the enabling mechanism. And essentially what it created was a doctrine that came out of the Catholic Church, and it was often known as the Doctrine of Discovery. It's not so much the case that Columbus sailed across the ocean, discovered the Americas, and gave birth to the age of exploration. It's more the case that the Doctrine of Discovery created an enabling mechanism that incentivized European nations to engage in exploration so they could claim ownership of the human beings and natural resources in lands that they would have otherwise had no claim to. In fact, the papal bulls and the Doctrine of Discovery that kind of encapsulates all of them gave birth to Columbus. As it goes then, Columbus went forward, and so too did many vassals of many European nations, planting flags. I claim this land in the name of the most Christian king, Don Philippe, once, twice, thrice, and by all the times that I can and should without limitations. And it was on. At this point in time, the Christian population was the white population of Europe and a scattering of browner people in the Middle East, but predominantly white. Everyone else who was indigenous to Africa, indigenous to different parts of Asia, indigenous to Australia, indigenous to the Americas, all of these indigenous populations were non-Christian. which meant preordained by God to serve. So the fault lines in our society, locking up the food, who would control the key, to a religious fault line, who is Christian and who is not, now became a racial fault line, because white people, being the Christians, were the ones preordained by God to rule, and black and brown people, the non-Christians, were preordained by God to serve. And this gave birth to the racial caste systems of the world and created the racial dynamics that we are still dealing with today. By the way, eventually there's a Protestant Reformation, and there are numerous changes within Christendom. England, for example, breaks with the Catholic Church and says we're creating our own national church, the Anglican Church. We repudiate the Pope. But when they did that, they still kept Catholic doctrine enshrined in British law. So the British common law often refers to Catholic documents. And the entire, age of discovery and all of the legal apparatuses around that also enshrine the doctrine of discovery in England, even after England has broken with the Catholic Church. When America has its revolution and breaks from England and says, we repudiate the British king and we want to be an independent, democratic nation, then what happens is the US government is still in its legal system referring to British common law, and even numerous decisions coming out of the United States Supreme Court refer to Catholic doctrine and the doctrine of discovery as the enabling mechanism for America's taking of land from indigenous people and taking of indigenous lives to acquire the land. So as an example, flash forward to 1855, and there's a treaty negotiation going on in Minnesota. Henry Rice is there, white guy, as treaty commissioner, and he's talking to the natives who are objecting. And the natives are saying, we object. We don't want to sign this treaty. We love our land. We don't want to move. And we don't want to sell our land. And Henry Rice says, what are you talking about? Your great white father already owns this land. You only have an aboriginal occupancy of the land. You can't own it. You're Indians. He even said that your great white father signed an agreement with France, talking about the Louisiana Purchase, and has further claim because of this agreement, even though no native person had ever sold the land in question to either France or the United States. So that concept was still the operating concept, that indigenous people only had aboriginal occupancy, not ownership rights. And that created a whole bunch of problems that followed afterward. As you think about the impact of the doctrine of discovery, it's good to think about the ways that we reinforce these concepts even today. For example, there are passages in the Bible that say, God created man in his image. And it's pretty obvious that human beings return the favor. Splattered all over the world are pictures of Nordic Jesus. Pictures of Jesus with blonde hair and blue eyes. Even though all the descriptions of Jesus in the Bible and all we know about his background says that he was a Semite, a Jew, and as a Semite, someone with brown skin and dark curly locks. He probably looked a little more like Osama bin Laden than Nordic Jesus. And the question should be asked, why do we reinforce this idea of blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus? And part of it is, as our fault lines shifted from religion to race in the enabling mechanisms for our systems of hierarchy and oppression. That religion has been a tool consistently applied throughout that time to reinforce the racial caste. And if those in power wanted to believe that God created man in his image, then God had to look like them, not like the other. And although there are plenty of people of all race who say, hey, there's one race, it's the human race, and things like that, that may be people's individual beliefs for some, but the systems, patterns, policies, practices, art, like images of Jesus, are all designed to reinforce a different reality. For me, it's as an indigenous person who's not a Christian, it's sometimes been difficult to navigate. I would like to say we can agree to disagree and still be friends with everybody on the planet. But what's sometimes been hard is that the systems, policies, procedures, and so forth that I deal with every day reinforce Christianity. For me, one of the things that's difficult in dealing with the fallout of the doctrine of discovery today is the way that it continues to order our lives. When I send my children to school, it is white Christian holidays that are honored in the school calendar rather than mine. Those norms, values, and assumptions are integrated into everything that happens in their pretendedly secular education. The music that they get to sing or have to sing for school choir events is Christian music, not indigenous music. And as a result, navigating the mainstream world still feels like navigating waters designed to wash away their indigeneity. And that's frustrating, and it shouldn't have to be like that. I feel like everyone's kids should be able to learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world. And that is the case for white kids when they go to school in this country, and that is not the case for everybody else. So as we think about what happened in the past, over 500 years ago with the development of the doctrine of discovery, it's important to remember that we are deeply impacted today by what has happened in the past. And we need to be aware of how our lives are impacted by these things so we can shape meaningful and positive change and to make the world a place where we can all thrive and all be supported and all be validated in equal measure. Thanks for watching today. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, free Ojibwe language resources, resources for teachers, and more. Miigwech.